Zekola Land, a novel by Amr Abdel Hamid. They say love is blind, and he says, I was blinded when I fell in love. But what can he do? He fell in love, and what happened, happened. Now he sits in his room every day and writes, I am Khaled Hosni, 28 years old, a graduate of Cairo's College of Commerce for 6 years. My hometown is Al-Bahu Freak in Dakalia Governorate. Today, my proposal to marry my beloved was rejected for the 8th time, for the same reason. Then he looked at the wall and hung the paper next to 7 others that seemed to have been hung at earlier times. On the first paper, he wrote his name, age, and hometown, and my proposal to marry my beloved was rejected today. Next to it, a second paper read, rejected for the 2nd time. The third paper stated his 3rd rejection, and so on until the 7th paper. After that, he leaned back and looked up. His memories took him back to 6 years ago, when he was in his final year at university. Fate had it that he met Mona, a girl from his hometown, by chance, on their way from the town to their university in Cairo. His joy increased when he learned she was studying at the same college in her 1st year. From that day, their meetings happened frequently, whether by design or accident. He snapped out of his memories and let out a strong sigh as he looked at a large paper he hung on the wall below the 8 papers. On it, he wrote, rejected for the same reason, Mona's crazy father. Whenever Khaled heard the word crazy, he always remembered Mona's father. And I don't think it was just Khaled, but all the townspeople. However, Khaled knew his madness more than anyone. Since he finished his studies and decided to propose to Mona, he was shocked when, during his first visit to ask for her hand, her father looked at him strangely and asked, Do you want to marry Mona? Yes. Then he asked again, and what have you done with your life? Khaled's face turned redder, and he got nervous as he didn't expect the question. He replied, what have I done with my life? Well, I graduated from Cairo University with a degree in commerce. You know, my parents passed away when I was young, and I live with my grandfather. I am currently looking for a suitable job. He interrupted, and how are you different from others to marry my daughter? Then he ended the meeting with a rejection. Khaled thought at the time that the reason for his first rejection was his lack of a suitable job. But he realized the reason might be something else entirely when he found a job and proposed to Mona again. He was met with rejection for the 2nd time and the same question from her father. What have you done with your life? How are you different from others? This question, which he never found a satisfactory answer to, haunted him through his 8 proposals. Her father never considered Khaled's love for his daughter or her love for him, until one day Khaled lost his patience and shouted at him, I haven't done anything with my life. What should I do? I know you fought in 1937. Do you think that's a reason to humiliate us? You want a hero for your daughter. Tell me, how can I become a hero? Should I go fight in Iraq to make you happy? Then he looked at him, anger in his eyes. I will marry her. I will marry Mona, even if it's against your will. Everyone in the town knows this man's odd ways. He wants to marry his only daughter to someone unique. What kind of unique person? No one knows. Everyone knows his daughter's fate is to remain unmarried as long as her father is this man. Despite this, Khaled never gave up. He only thought about what would make him unique, what would make him deserve Mona in her father's eyes. But what is it? He doesn't know. So he prayed to God to take her father away. Although Khaled was known for his light-heartedness and cheerful spirit, his love for Mona and her father's constant rejection made sadness a constant feature on his face. His grandfather, who was nearing 80 and had lived with Khaled since his parents passed away, noticed his deep sadness after the last rejection. He approached him and asked, "Are you still upset? You should have gotten used to it by now." Khaled replied, "I can't imagine seeing her with someone else. I don't know what her father wants. Doesn't he know that the age of miracles is over? Will you just sit next to me with your hand on your cheek? What should I do?" The grandfather laughed, teasing him. "Ha! You'd better bury yourself in a cellar." Khaled's eyes lit up as if he remembered something. "The cellar," he continued. "Grandpa, do you remember when I was little? And whenever I cried, you'd tell me the story about the cellar under our village and how you went down there more than 50 years ago." His grandfather replied with a smile. "Yes, of course, I remember when you used to cry. Want me to remind you of those days?" Khaled laughed. "Yes, tell me about the cellar and your trip down there." His grandfather paused, recalling, "Oh, those were the days. We were 4 mischievous young men. We heard many stories about a treasure hidden in a cellar under our village, a place that used to be a big storehouse for the rich during invasions. But no one dared to enter because it was said to be haunted by spirits, and whoever went in would never come out. But we dismissed those tales and decided to go in. We knew the entrance was in an abandoned house in the village behind a large rock. One night, we went there secretly, managed to move the rock, and started to descend one by one, each carrying an oil lamp. After descending a long staircase, we found ourselves in a tunnel. We walked a few steps until we could barely breathe. Suddenly, all the oil lamps went out at once, and one of us screamed, "Ghost!" We all ran back up, tripping over each other. Since then, no one has dared to go down there. Khaled laughed, "But it remains a sweet memory. At least you weren't afraid to go down, even if you ran back up." His grandfather jokingly frowned. "Don't tell anyone about how we ran." Later, Khaled went to his room and tried to sleep, but he couldn't. He kept thinking about what his grandfather had told him. He knew it sounded like a legend, but the cellar did exist, and his grandfather never lied. He suddenly looked at a paper stating the reason for Mona's father's refusal. He wants someone who matches his madness, a unique person. He thought to himself, "I won't marry anyone but Mona, or I won't marry at all." Then he spoke aloud. "So, what if I go down the cellar? What if there really is a treasure?" Then he fell silent and talked to himself as if someone else was speaking. "What treasure? That's crazy talk. Remember, the cellar is haunted by ghosts and spirits." Then he thought again, "If you're a coward, you don't deserve Mona. Are you happy with your life as it is? A commerce graduate working a job unrelated to commerce, studying for 4 years just to work in a drugstore. If it weren't for living with your grandfather, your salary would be gone by mid-month. If you love Mona, prove it to yourself and her. If you find that treasure, you'll be the most famous person in this village. No, in Egypt, no, in the whole world. If you don't find it, at least you tried." He then jumped out of bed, took out a picture of Mona and looked at it, saying, "I'm going down that cellar no matter what. If her father is crazy, then I can be madness itself sometimes." Khaled thought he was talking to himself alone, not knowing that someone was listening. His grandfather stood by the door, overhearing his loud thoughts. Yet no surprise showed on his face, as if this decision was something he had expected. He stood there until Khaled fell silent. The lights went out, and the familiar sound of his grandson sleeping filled the room. Then he left, leaning on his cane, and went to his room. He sat silently on his couch for a few minutes, then used his cane to pull a small, old wooden box closer. He opened it and took out an old photo album covered in dust. After wiping off the dust, he started flipping through the pages, stopping for a long time at one picture. The next day, Khaled and his grandfather woke up early as they always did. Khaled had to go to work early, and his grandfather didn't sleep after the dawn prayer. He would read the Quran until Khaled woke up, and they would have breakfast together, which a girl living next door prepared for them. She had been doing this for years. As they sat, Khaled kept looking at his grandfather as if he wanted to tell him something until he broke the silence and asked, Abdo, as he liked to call him, "Can you live alone?" His grandfather looked at him, pretending not to understand the question. "Do you want to travel, or what?" Khaled stayed silent, then looked at him again and asked seriously, "If I traveled for a little while, could you live alone?" Then he added, as if clarifying his words, "I know my words shock you, but I decided to leave the country for a while. I swear I'll come back as soon as possible, and you won't even feel my absence." He then tried to justify his talk. "I want to travel to any place where I can find myself, where I can feel my existence. Do you know what your grandson, a commerce graduate, is working as?" "Yes, working in a drugstore." "Your grandson is working as a porter in a drugstore." "A porter? Take this box, put it here, take that box, and put it there." Then he got up to leave and said to his grandfather, "I'll travel for a short while." He turned to go outside, but his grandfather's words stopped him. "Why are you lying, Khaled? Why don't you want to tell me that you want to go down to the cellar?" Those words hit Khaled like a thunderbolt. He had fabricated his desire to travel so his grandfather wouldn't find out and think he'd gone mad. He didn't know how his grandfather figured out his plan. He looked at him confused. "Cellar? How did you know? I mean, what cellar and what nonsense?" His grandfather continued. "I knew a long time ago, a very long time ago." He then ordered him to sit down again and asked seriously, "Why do you want to go down to the cellar?" Khaled stayed silent, then tried to make the conversation a joke. "Why are you insisting on this cellar story? I'm telling you, I want to travel." His grandfather repeated the question. "Khaled, why do you want to go down to the cellar?" With no way out, Khaled let out a long sigh and answered, "I want to go down to prove to Mona and her father that I'm a hero, that I'm different from others." His grandfather asked, "Just that?" Khaled answered in surprise, "Yes, just that." He added, "And who knows, maybe I'll find the treasure you guys went down for before." His grandfather repeated, "Just that?" "Yes." His grandfather said seriously, "That's not why you want to go down." Khaled looked at him, surprised by the seriousness he had never seen on his face before. His grandfather continued, "What if Mona married someone else? Would you still go down to the cellar or not?" Khaled stayed silent, and his grandfather continued, "I will never believe you want to go down for Mona. You want to go down for a completely different reason, the same reason I went down and others did too. The reason that runs in our blood, my blood, your blood, and your father's blood. The reason is our love for the unknown, our love for discovering something new, our love for rebellion, our love for being different." He added, "When you were little, I used to tell you about the cellar when you cried, and maybe you saw it as just a story to calm you down. But believe me, I knew the day would come when you grow up, and I would tell you again about the cellar, just a little story about it, and it would stir you up inside." He continued, "How many times did Mona's father reject you, and you knew the reason? Why this time did you want to be a hero? Until yesterday it happened inside you, the same thing that happened to your father the day I told him about the cellar. But the difference is I knew you wanted to go down, while he just left suddenly." Khaled interrupted. "My father went down to the cellar," his grandfather replied. "Not just your father and your mother. They thought they would go on a short trip and come back. That's why they left you when you were 2 years old and said they would be back in a few days. But the days turned into months, and the months turned into years, and the years passed, and they never came back. Everyone in the village thought they died in an accident. Everyone thanked God that you weren't with them and survived the accident. But the truth is, they went down to the cellar. He sighed and continued, I never blamed them for that. I tell myself, you went down to the cellar too, and were proud of yourself. But the difference is, God saved you. Then he looked at Khaled. That's why I will never be upset if you also go down to the cellar, even if I know this decision might take you away from me. But you must be sure you're going down for yourself, not for an imaginary reason you created for yourself, which is Mona. He got up and walked a few steps, giving his back to Khaled, and said, when you decide, tell me, because there's still a lot to say about Forek Cellar that someone else will tell you. After that, Khaled left and didn't go to work as he usually did. Instead, he went to meet Mona after she called him and asked to meet at a place inside Mansoura University, where they always met. On his way, he could only think about his grandfather's words, wondering if he wanted to go down to the cellar for love of Mona or for adventure. Then he remembered his grandfather's talk about his parents, whom he knew nothing about. He always found himself with his grandfather and never saw a single picture of his father or mother. He could only imagine them through the words of some relatives, that he was tall like his father, about the same height as his father, who was over 100 centimeters tall, as they used to say, with broad shoulders and a strong build. These things, they said, he inherited from his father. As for his mother's relatives, they always told him his dark black hair and constant smile always resembled his mother. His thoughts then returned to that man his grandfather mentioned, who had a lot to say about the cellar, and the name he heard for the first time, Forek Cellar. His mind was occupied until he reached the place where he was supposed to meet Mona. He found her waiting, wearing her distinctive hijab with its many colors and her black abaya, which he always teased her about, saying he felt unlucky when she wore it. He looked at her with a smile, but she didn't smile back as usual and said, I'm sorry my father did this to you for the 8th time. He laughed. No, I'm used to it. I'm already infamous in the village. People say I've set a record for being rejected for your marriage and that I should enter the Guinness Book of Records. He said these words to cheer her up, but it didn't work, and she continued. I thought like you that my father wanted someone different, but unfortunately, my father changed suddenly. Khaled was shocked. What do you mean he changed? She replied, a doctor proposed to my father to marry me, and of course I was sure my father would refuse, but I was shocked he agreed. He shouted, what? He agreed? Yes, he agreed and insisted I marry him. Some tears fell while Khaled was lost in thought. And me? I tried to talk to him about my love for you, but he slapped me and said he knows what's best for me, that my future is secure with the doctor, and that I would struggle with you. Mona was speaking, her words mixed with tears. Khaled listened, unable to believe what he heard. What does this crazy father want? He told him he wanted his unique daughter, but it seemed he wanted anyone but Khaled Hassani. Is this love of all those years wasted overnight? He never loved anyone as he loved her. Why didn't she object to her father's decision? Did she give in out of fear of his anger? These were the questions swirling in his mind as she spoke, until she asked him to leave so he wouldn't be late, motioning for him to depart sarcastically as if she was fleeing from their meeting. He smiled without a word. It was the first time he let her leave alone. He sat there, watching her leave, as if it were the last time he would see her, feeling choked with this suffocating sensation. It was the first time he felt defeated with her, a feeling he had never experienced before. He didn't realize every time he proposed to her and was rejected. He knew there was something called hope, even if he proposed 100 times until her father accepted. He remembers enduring people's stares and mockery when he told them he would marry her one day, and their love story would be immortalized in history. He thought himself foolish when he once asked to marry her without her father's knowledge, only to be refused, and their feud lasted long. But he's even more foolish now. She'll agree to marry that doctor just to appease her conscience. Nothing else. Just a few moments. That's how he narrated it. Love of years melting like ice in a moment until his distraction was cut by the ringing of his phone. When he answered, he found his employer scolding him for being absent. Unable to contain his nerves, he told him he wouldn't work for him again and hung up immediately. Afterward, he returned to his town, walking its streets with his head down, feeling the taste of defeat in his throat. He didn't want to talk to anyone until he reached his home. He entered his room and looked at its walls, always adorned with his marriage proposal papers to Mona. The walls were covered with those papers he had been rejected with 8 times. Standing in front of each sheet individually, he mocked himself, laughing loudly as if madness had struck him. Then he tore them up, burying his head in his hands. Lost in his memories once again, he sat on the floor of the room, then rose and went to his grandfather's room. Finding him finished with his prayers, he asked, "You told me someone knows a lot about the cellar?" His grandfather replied calmly, "Have you made up your mind?" "Yes, I want to go down to the cellar for Mona." Khaled restrained himself. "Mona is gone from my life, and I've given up my job. I must go down." Then he continued, "I must find one thing in my life that I can tell my father about after me, to feel once that I'm a hero in my own eyes. The feeling of my failure is killing me." His grandfather asked him, "Aren't you afraid you might end up like your parents?" He replied, "Believe me, the only thing I was afraid of was leaving you alone. But now that you're encouraging me, there's no fear in my heart." His grandfather smiled. "What about ghosts and spirits, and that it might be haunted?" "I don't think I'll find a ghost harder than human beings. I've decided to go down, and you were right when you said Mona wasn't the reason. After Mona left my life, my love for going down has grown stronger than before. Maybe I'll find in the cellar the memory that will help me forget the humiliation of 6 years ago." Then he asked his grandfather, "Who is this man, and where can I find him?" His grandfather smiled. "Don't worry, he heard everything we said, and he's probably sure you really want to go down." Khaled looked at his grandfather in astonishment, as if he didn't understand anything, when an old man entered. He was about the same age as his grandfather. Immediately, his grandfather spoke up and pointed to the old man, saying, "I know him, the crazy one from the cellar. You must know him too." Khaled looked at him and said, "Yes, of course. It's Hajj Mustafa Asalan." His grandfather continued, "Mustafa was the first one who thought of going down into the cellar 50 years ago. We used to call him the crazy one from the cellar. He always said he had information about the cellar that no one else knew, and he waited for the day someone would decide to go down there after your parents didn't return. Then he left them to continue their conversation alone." Khaled looked at the old man in surprise from what his grandfather had said. He had known him for many years, but didn't know he was the crazy one from the cellar his grandfather had talked about when he was young. The old man broke the silence. "Your grandfather told me how much you want to go down to Forek Cellar. I'm sure now." "Yes, but it's the first time I've heard the cellar called Forek's," the old man continued. "That's its real name, and if you search anywhere, you won't find any information about it." He sighed and continued, "People think your grandfather and I are crazy if we talk about the cellar, and they don't believe we actually went down there 50 years ago. But they're right about it. Khaled asked him. They're right? What do you mean? Yes, they're right. Maybe that's the information only I know. We four didn't go down to Forek Cellar 50 years ago, and maybe that's why I asked your grandfather to leave us alone, because I didn't want to break his pride. So what was the tunnel we went down? The tunnel was just a passage to Forek Cellar. The proof is that the tunnel wasn't very deep and had a certain distance. The biggest proof is that the gas lamps went out minutes after we went down. Oh, the ghosts. The man laughed. No, you mean ventilation. The tunnel, not the cellar, had low oxygen, and it could have been non-existent if the descent door closed. Then the gas lamps would have turned off. I said a ghost, and everyone was scared and ran away. But then I found out it was someone's imagination. From inside, my happiness was indescribable, because I felt I'd put my foot on the first road to the cellar. I kept hoping to reach the cellar one day, but the years passed, the disease surrounded me, and I kept waiting for someone else to go down to the cellar and achieve my dream. Then he pulled an old book out of his possession and continued. This book is from one copy, written by a person who went down to the cellar before. I found it by chance in my father's books when I was young, but unfortunately, the time factor affected it before I found it. It was safe from him, about 10 sheets of paper talking about Forek Cellar. Then he gave Khaled the book and pointed out that he should read the book's lines in his voice. Khaled took the book to read its pages, while the old man sat to listen to him, sipping a cup of already cold tea. Khaled began reading the handwritten lines that spoke of Forek, one of the wealthy men of the Mamluk era who owned the area where his town, the courtyard of Forek, was located. He ordered the excavation of a deep vault to serve as a refuge for him and his town in case of invasion, a project that took more than 15 years to dig and build, storing many treasures from that time. The writer then talked about his journey to the vault and the tunnel that lacked ventilation, requiring a quick passage to the real staircase of the vault, which extended more than 30 meters underground. Since that moment, there hadn't been any ventilation problems. The vault was ingeniously designed with an unknown method of ventilation. Khaled was intrigued to read that the vault remained dark, even on nights when the full moon shone in the sky. It was the craftsmanship of the past engineers. Such skill. The sentence remained unfinished as the 10 pages ended. Khaled looked at the old man eagerly. What did he discover? The old man replied that he didn't know, finding the book in that state. The question of what the author of the book discovered had occupied him for 50 years. Then he looked at Khaled. If you want to discover what he found out, you must be in the vault tonight. Tonight? Yes, tonight is the full moon, and according to the book, that's when the vault is illuminated. Khaled fell silent for a moment, then looked at him. I'm ready to go down. Ready for the opportunity of my life. As the hour approached 6, the old man left, leaving Khaled with the book that he had read multiple times, each time increasing his desire to descend into the vault. Curiosity drove him to learn what the book's author had discovered, feeling like he possessed a secret from the ages. He asked himself, did he discover treasures beyond counting? Are there artifacts below that could make me the discoverer of the 21st century? Lost in daydreams, he wondered. The sun neared setting as he climbed to the top of his house and looked at his town, observing its agricultural lands, tall trees, and birds adorning them. He looked at the neighboring houses as if seeing them for the last time, inhaling the sweet scent of his homeland and talking to it, hoping it wouldn't be his last day here. Then he returned to his room to prepare for his journey. Time passed, and night fell, the sky adorned with the full moon. He waited for the calm to settle in the town, knowing he wouldn't wait long. By around 10 in the evening at the latest, his friend Dr. Majid Munir would arrive, closing his pharmacy past midnight. He didn't want anyone to see him as he headed. That abandoned house on the edge of town, until the clock struck 1 in the morning. He smiled, saying goodbye, and got ready to leave. He looked at his grandfather with a smile and said, "God willing, I will come back." His grandfather smiled and said, "You will definitely come back, God willing." Then he asked him to wait a moment, took out the wooden box, opened it, and took out the old photo album. Khaled asked him, "What is this?" His grandfather flipped through some pages and stopped at a picture he had paused at before. He said to him, "Do you know who these are?" Khaled looked at it, still in shock. His grandfather continued, "This is a picture of your father and mother. It was the last picture of them before they left me." Then his eyes filled with tears. Khaled's eyes filled with tears too, and he kept staring at it. "It's the first time I've seen their picture." His grandfather continued, "I have been waiting for this day, and I tortured myself for this day." Then he gave him the picture, wiped his tears with his hand, and hugged him. Khaled whispered in his ear, "I will come back to you, Abdo. I will come back." Then he left.